Okay, so today we're diving deep into a pretty pivotal part of the 20th century. We're talking about the Cold War. And we're going to really dig into what made this global ideological struggle so complex, going beyond just the basics here.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to take apart some of the defining features of the Cold War. It lasted for a good chunk of time there from 1947 to 1991, and we'll look at the impact it had around the world using a variety of analytical lenses.
All right, so let's start by really defining what the Cold War was all about. So it wasn't a direct military battle between the main players of the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but there's definitely this constant geopolitical tension.
Exactly. You had the United States leading NATO and the Soviet Union in charge of the Warsaw Pact. But what really makes this era stand out is that those superpowers never went head to head in a huge war.
Right. Instead, you have this ideological clash between democracy and communism, and of course the economic systems of capitalism and socialism.
Absolutely. That ideological battle was really at the heart of many of the Cold War's defining features. One of the biggest was this idea of nuclear deterrence, the threat of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. It's kind of paradoxical, but that terrifying potential of nuclear weapons is actually what kept the major powers from going to war directly.
It was this crazy balancing act based on the fear of total annihilation. But beyond the threat of nuclear war, the Cold War played out in other ways too, like with espionage and all this strategic use of propaganda.
That's right. Intelligence agencies like the CIA and the KGB were super active. They were running all these covert operations, trying to further their own interests and, destabilize the other side. And then you had all this propaganda being pumped out, to make their own system look good and the other side look bad.
And we can't forget about the economic side of things. The Cold War wasn't just about military power or ideology. It was also this competition between two very different economic models.
Exactly. You had the U.S. pushing for free market capitalism, all about private ownership and global trade. Think of things like the Marshall Plan. And then you had the Soviets advocating for a centrally planned economy, state-controlled with things being coordinated through COMECON.
And it's kind of fascinating how the term Cold War actually came to describe this really unique type of conflict. It's not like there was some formal declaration of war like in the past.
No, you're right. It was journalist Walter Lippmann who really popularized the term. He perfectly captured the essence of the era, highlighting how there wasn't this massive direct war between the superpowers. But at the same time, their rivalry was shaping global politics in huge ways.
So we've got a basic understanding now. But it's important to remember that the Cold War wasn't just this contained conflict between two powerful countries. It became this global phenomenon. So what made it spread so far?
Well, you've got to think about how the Cold War went way beyond just Washington and Moscow. After World War II, you had all this decolonization happening. All these new countries were popping up in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and they became these battlegrounds for influence between the superpowers. People even called them third world battlefields.
So basically both the U.S. and the Soviet Union were scrambling to get allies and stop the other side from getting a foothold in these new nations.
Yeah, exactly. And the formation of these massive alliance systems really globalized the conflict. NATO and the Warsaw Pact solidified the ideological and military divide in Europe, but then you had other alliances like CETO and CENTO pulling other regions into the Cold War.
So it went way beyond just formal alliances. This expansion of influence also happened through economic and cultural means too, right?
Absolutely. Both sides were very actively trying to exert influence in a variety of ways. The U.S. had economic aid programs like the Marshall Plan, which was partly about rebuilding war-torn economies, but it was also about, bringing countries into their sphere of influence. The Soviets had similar aid programs within their own bloc, and then you had all these cultural exchanges. The U.S. would send out American films and music, and the Soviets promoted their own cinema and things like ballet. Even education programs became tools for spreading their own values and worldview.
It's amazing how these things that seem kind of removed from warfare became such important parts of this global rivalry.
Yeah.
And the consequences were felt all around the world, like you said.
Oh, definitely. The impact of this global competition could be seen everywhere. You had direct military intervention or a ton of support going to opposing factions in all these conflicts, from Vietnam and Southeast Asia to the Angolan Civil War in Africa, and even to Central America with the conflict in Nicaragua. Even the space race, with things like the Soviet Sputnik launch and the American Apollo program became this big public display of technological and by extension ideological dominance. It was all being watched by the entire world.
And this brings us to this really important idea of proxy wars. Because direct conflict between the superpowers was just too risky, they often fought through other countries. Could you explain a bit more about how proxy wars worked during the Cold War?
Sure. So basically, proxy wars were a way for the major powers to get involved in conflicts without directly fighting each other. They would support opposing sides in these third-party conflicts. This let them compete and try to spread their influence without risking this, apocalyptic nuclear war.
So these other countries became these battlegrounds for the ideological and strategic goals of the Cold War. Can you give us some key examples of these proxy wars and what happened?
Of course. So one of the most significant examples is the Korean War, which went on from 1950 to 1953. You had North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union, and China invading South Korea, who had the support of the U.S. and the UN. It ended in a stalemate, and Korea is still divided to this day, right along with the 38th parallel. It's a very visible reminder of how the Cold War reshaped the world.
A perfect example of the lasting impact the Cold War had on geopolitics. What other important proxy wars happened during this time?
Well, the Vietnam War is another huge one. It went on for a long time from 1955 to 1975. Communist North Vietnam, backed by the Soviets and China, wanted to unify the country under communist rule, and the U.S., sticking to their policy of containment, backed South Vietnam. The U.S. got deeply involved militarily, but in the end they withdrew, and Vietnam was unified under communist rule.
That was definitely a turning point in the Cold War and a blow to the U.S. strategy of containing communism in Southeast Asia. Were there any similar situations where the Soviets got involved in proxy wars?
Oh, yeah, for sure. The Soviet-Afghan War from 1979 to 1989 is a prime example. The Soviets intervened to prop up the communist government in Afghanistan, but they were fighting against Mujahideen rebels who had support from the U.S. This war was really costly for the Soviets, and many people believe it played a major role in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union.
And you mentioned the Angolan Civil War before. How did that long-running conflict fit into this whole idea of proxy wars?
Well, the Angolan Civil War started in 1975, right after Angola got its independence. It quickly became this battleground for the Cold War. Both the U.S. and the Soviets were supporting different factions in Angola, and that turned what was basically a local power struggle into a major theater of indirect conflict between the superpowers. That outside support just made the war go on longer and made the consequences so much worse for the people of Angola.
It really shows how, even though the superpowers weren't directly fighting each other, their rivalry caused so much suffering in these smaller countries that got caught in the middle.
Absolutely. The U.S. and the Soviet Union may have avoided a direct military confrontation, but these proxy wars caused tremendous human suffering and left behind a lot of instability in the regions where they were fought.
So we've talked about the actual fighting in proxy wars, but at its heart, the Cold War was also this clash of ideas. It was this huge political and ideological struggle. Can you expand on that aspect of the Cold War?
Definitely. You could really say that the Cold War was this fundamental conflict between two major ideologies: liberal democracy championed by the U.S. and communism promoted by the Soviet Union. This ideological battle was everywhere in international relations, and it even affected the domestic policies of both sides.
So what were the main ideas behind these two competing ideologies during the Cold War?
Well, from the perspective of the U.S. and its allies, the focus was on liberal democracy. That meant protecting individual rights and freedoms, having multiple political parties, and holding free and fair elections. On the economic side, the big idea was capitalism. Private property, a free market, and encouraging individual initiative. And this was often supported by things like international aid programs.
And what about the Soviet Union and its allies? What was their ideology all about?
The Soviet Union was promoting the ideology of communism. Their focus was on collective rights and the importance of the working class. Politically, this usually meant that the Communist Party was the only party in power and that political participation was very controlled by the state. Economically, the Soviet model was all about socialism. The state owned the means of production, the economy was centrally planned, and economic decisions were made collectively. And this was often coordinated with other Eastern Bloc countries through COMECON.
So you have this major difference in values and principles that went beyond just military and economic competition. How did this war of ideas actually play out in the real world?
Well, this ideological struggle really infiltrated everything. Both sides were involved in these really sophisticated propaganda campaigns. They were trying to spread their own message and make the other side's system look bad. For instance, you had Radio Free Europe, which was funded by the U.S. It broadcasted into Eastern Europe to try to counteract the Soviet Union's control over information. And the Soviets had their own huge propaganda machine that was promoting communist ideology and criticizing the West.
So it was all about trying to win over public opinion around the world and get people to side with their ideology.
Exactly. And cultural diplomacy also played a big role in this. The U.S. would sponsor tours of American musicians like jazz bands to show off American culture and values. The Soviet Union promoted its own achievements in things like ballet and classical music to show the world that their cultural system was better. Even things like scientific and academic competition became tied up with this ideological battle, especially the space race. Every achievement was a chance to prove that their ideology was superior.
It's amazing how even science and culture became part of this ideological war.
Yeah.
And what about countries that didn't want to pick a side? How did they deal with this really polarized global environment?
Well, the non-aligned movement popped up. Leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru from India show how tough it was for countries that wanted to stay neutral during this big superpower rivalry. These countries tried to forge their own paths, often taking ideas from both the capitalist and socialist models, but trying really hard to avoid being controlled by either superpower.
And finally, how did this ideological struggle affect the lives of ordinary people in the Cold War powers and their allies?
The ideological narratives of the Cold War had a huge impact domestically. Education systems were often used to instill certain values and worldviews. Scientific research was often influenced by Cold War priorities, especially in areas related to defense and technology. Popular culture, like books, movies, and music, often reflected and reinforced the dominant Cold War narratives. The other side was often portrayed as this existential threat. Even sporting events like the Olympics became super politicized. Winning became this symbolic victory for their ideology.
After decades of this intense competition, the Cold War finally ended. Could you give us a quick rundown of what caused the Soviet Union to collapse in 1991?
The collapse of the Soviet Union was a result of a lot of things, both internal and external. The Soviet economy was stagnating, there was growing political dissent, and the arms race was just unsustainable. It put a huge strain on their resources. And then you had reformist leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev come to power. His policies of glasnost and perestroika really accelerated the changes that were already happening. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 is often seen as the symbolic moment that signaled the end was near for the Eastern Bloc.
And while the Cold War is over, its impact is still being felt today. What are some of the lasting effects that we can still see in the world?
The Cold War left behind a long legacy, and it continues to shape the world in many ways. The expansion of NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union is still a big factor in the relationship between the West and Russia. And while maybe not as immediate as during the Cold War, nuclear proliferation is still a major global threat.
Yeah, the fact that there are still so many nuclear weapons out there and the possibility that more countries might get them, that's a direct result of the Cold War. What other lasting impacts can you point to?
A lot of the ideological debates from the Cold War, especially the arguments between capitalism and socialism, are still going on in many countries. And a lot of international institutions that were created or heavily influenced by the Cold War, like NATO and the institutions created at Bretton Woods, are still major players in global governance and relations between countries.
So it's like the structures from the Cold War are still influencing things, even though it's over.
Exactly. And maybe the most important thing for understanding the world today is that a lot of the concepts and dynamics that we saw during the Cold War, things like spheres of influence, ideological competition, and proxy wars, those are still relevant when we try to analyze current conflicts and tensions, like the changing relationship between the U.S. and China or the debates about interventionism and national security.
So really, to understand what's going on in the world today, you need to have a good grasp of the Cold War. It's not just history.
That's right. The Cold War is a really important case study. It shows us how powerful these competing political visions are and how they can shape global politics and leave behind legacies that last for generations.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive into the Cold War.
Mhm.
It's clear that it was way more complex than just a standoff between two superpowers. It was this global event with all these different layers.
Absolutely. It highlights the lasting power of ideology and all the complex forces that shape how countries interact with each other.
And on that note, we'd like to leave you with a question to think about. How might we see these ideological battles that were so central to the Cold War playing out in different ways in the 21st century? Even though we don't have the same clear-cut superpower rivalry that we used to, it's a question worth pondering. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.